afternoon. With a global pandemic, civil unrest, and an upcoming election where the result is already being questioned, heck, it might even be litigated right now, 2020 has been an eventful, if not overwhelming year. Today, however, at the World Affairs Council, we hope to bring some humor to your day as we welcome political satirist P.J. O'Rourke to our virtual living room. Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, president of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. And P.J. O'Rourke is the author of A Cry from the Far Middle, Dispatches from a Divided Land, and moderating today's program is a very special friend, Ambassador James Oberwetter. I know him as Jim. He's a Dallas fixture, known too for his own wry sense of humor and irony. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping details. I hope that you'll buy or purchase of A Cry from the Far Middle from Dallas's independent bookstore, Interrobang Books. Just go to interrobangbooks.com. Be sure to type in the code dfwworld and get 10% off, not just on A Cry from the Far Middle, but on any books that happen to be in your shopping cart. You know, one of the reasons we're able to put on programs like this is we have generous supporters. And I particularly want to thank Maisie Heiken, who made a gift, I guess now about 4 or 5 weeks ago. And so you've seen her name several times. If you'd like to make a gift, you can sponsor a program for $500 or $1,000. Just send me an email, and I hope that you'll be one of our very important sponsors. I also want to thank our promotional partner, that's the Fort Worth Club. Now, coming up are a number of programs, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I hope that you'll go to dfwworld.org to keep up with our schedule. And of course, you can always go to our YouTube channel. Again, not surprisingly, that's at DFW World. So let me tell you about Jim. One thing that's probably not on his resume is that he was vice chairman of the World Affairs Council when I first joined back in 2001. And he was a remarkable leader and a mentor. And what you see at our World Affairs Council, the foundation was built by Jim Oberwetter. He's a graduate of what he calls the university. That's the University of Texas at Austin. He went from there to be press secretary for then Congressman George H.W. Bush. Later, he ran government relations at Hunt Consolidated before being invited by his good friend, George W. Bush, to serve as our nation's ambassador to Saudi Arabia. That was a position he held from 2004 to 2007. He returned to Dallas, where he was president and CEO of the Dallas Regional Chamber. And since leaving the chamber, you never really know where he is. He might be in Canada or he might be somewhere in the United States, but you know he's been enjoying his grandchildren, golf, and rumor has it that one day he'll be back here at the World Affairs Council talking about his own novel. Jim, I turn it over to you and look forward to enjoying the program.
Well, Jim, thank you very much for that kind introduction. What a job you have done and the members of the World Affairs Council, including this program today. So we really thank you for the work you've done. I want to welcome now the sequestered members of the council. We've all been hunkered down for a good long while, and it's not a lot of fun. But today, I promise you, we are going to have some fun with an author who has just published his 20th book, A Cry from the Far Middle, Dispatches from a Divided Land. Zooming in from his home in the mountains of New Hampshire is P.J. O'Rourke, America's finest political satirist, commentator, journalist, and raconteur. He was born in Ohio, and he graduated from Miami University. He tells me not the water skiing one, but the one in Ohio, and went on to get his master's in English at Johns Hopkins. When he was a student, and for some time thereafter, you would have to say that he had described himself as something of a lefty coming out of school. And so he started his writing and he moved to where else but to New York. And not long after, he became the editor-in-chief of a magazine called the National Lampoon. And he was there when that magazine was at its absolute funniest. He then began a libertarian move. That streak emerged as he moved over to begin writing for the Rolling Stone, where he was attached to the Stone for almost 20 years. and hold that thought about the Rolling Stone. I'm coming right back to that. Most of us on this call know him for his superb writing for the Atlantic magazine and for other national magazines. And I think that many of us would know him from listening to NPR because he is one of the funniest panelists on that program's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. Almost said, don't ask me. He's fully evolved as a libertarian today. Thus, he's the H.L. Mencken Scholar Fellow at Cato Institute. And of late, he's become editor-in-chief of a new 100% free magazine, he tells me, called American Consequences, which is devoted to the subject of this country's dire financial situation. Now, wait, let's go back to Rolling Stone, because what many of you probably do not know is that his job there was Foreign Affairs Desk Chief. He might even have been the department head, the bureau head. I'm not sure it had more than one person in it, but he was that guy. And that's important for us to know today because PJ has 40 countries, that's 40 countries under his belt, and many wonderful reports, some very tough reports from war-torn areas of the world. So he told me when we started that he hopes he won't just be taking questions about his new book. And with that kind of international experience and with this kind of audience, it's wonderful of you, PJ, to say that you would take those kinds of questions. So we welcome you again, and I have the honor to start with a question about the young people of, in your words, in your book's title words, of our divided land. Do the millennials of today remind you of anyone you knew in the period which you have described as the hazy 60s in which you were involved? Is there a real difference in the protestations that we see today than the ones when you were railing against the established order at that time? Are we in more serious difficulty today or not? What do you say?
Mr. Ambassador, no, we're not. No, we're not. You know, people who are understandably upset with the partisan fracas that's going on, the rioting and the really unpleasant counter demonstrations, and of course the looting and the destruction is, especially with the small businesses, is just heartbreaking. But in point of fact, things were much worse 50 years ago. First place, we had a couple of much bigger issues than we have now. We had the war. We had the war in Vietnam, and the war in Vietnam was regarded by people my age. I was in college. We were having a wonderful time. We were letting our hair grow. We had discovered marijuana. We discovered free love. There was the pill. We were just having a great time. And all of a sudden, the government wanted to come in and break up the party, you know, shave our heads and send us off to shoot people that we never even heard of. And what's worse than that, they were going to shoot back. So we took that amiss, and we were out in the streets causing all sorts of trouble. And then in our inner cities, of course, and that was my end of the thing, was sort of the comic side of it. The tragic side of it was the fury, the anger in the inner cities that led to a kind of rioting that dwarfs anything that we're seeing now. The 82nd Airborne had to be sent into Detroit in the summer of 1967. And that was a huge issue because we had been moving toward a much better legal and social position about racial equality and about integration, about all of those questions. It wasn't just a matter of like attitude and subtleties like it was today. It was de jure legal discrimination against Black people. We had overcome that to a certain extent by the time the worst riots in the 60s, but the people on whose behalf we had supposedly overcome all these things had not been recipients of any benefit from this. And they were understandably frustrated and furious. So I really think that the divisions of today are fairly not small. The divisions are large, but they're farcical compared to the divisions of the 1960s. And then let us not forget, the heck with the 1960s. What about the 1860s? There was a little thing in 1861 called the Civil War. Now that was divided.
Well, thank you for that analysis, PJ, because I know a lot of people who are watching today and listening deeply concerned about where we are in the country with the pandemic and with a very hot presidential race, and all of the others, problems with policing that we've had around the country. And so I really appreciate that from someone who was there before and who had very strong feelings during those days.
I did. You know, I was not only a veteran of the 60s, I was in my own small way a cause of the 60s. And boy, it made the grown-ups mad. And looking back on it, I don't blame them one bit. Although I'm still not a great fan of the Vietnam War. There were 7 guys I went to school with, high school and college with, who were killed in the Vietnam War. And, you know, for what?
Got it. Well, you know what? I promised our members that we would have some fun here today and started with a really serious question.
That's all right.
And thank you for your response. But let's turn to something that's in your new book that I found to be very funny, and that is your view of our land, our divided land. And I believe you called it the coastals versus the Heartlanders. And I know that you're a Buckeye, so there must be some heartland there, even though you're in New Hampshire looking at the rest of the country. Can you talk to us and tell us why you did it that way?
Well, there really is a fundamental divide in the United States between the coastal elites. Mind you, they aren't on all the coasts. So you don't see much of them around the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, and you don't see many of them around the coast of Alaska. But you know where they are, you know, New York, Washington, Los Angeles, San Francisco. And in the big cities, the coastal elites, and then of course there's all the little college towns that they occupy in a sort of like gulag across the kind of woke archipelago all across the United States, and they get on the rest of our nerves. And the root of the thing is that these are people that kind of know-it-alls. You know, I mean, they know all about a vegan. They know all about locavore and fair traded, about GMO free and lactose intolerant and every sort of aspect, but they don't know hay from straw. And it just infuriates the rest of us. And I think if you wanted the simplest explanation for why Donald Trump got elected in 2016, it was that anger and frustration of the Heartlanders with the know-it-all coastal elites who really seem to be, you know, just totally separated from ordinary life, can't start the lawnmower by themselves.
So there is a chapter that addresses this in your book, and you do what amounts to self-description, if you would, of the Heartlanders versus the coastals. Could you lead us through 2 or 3 questions so those who are watching today might tell where they fit?
Well, you know, for instance, if you got backyard chickens, you might be a coastal elite. That's a very big thing with the coastal elites at the moment. If you've got backyard baby raccoon, backyard 6 pit bulls, backyard chickens and turkeys and ducks, and a deer that you shot during deer season hanging up from the tree, then you're probably a Heartlander. It's you know, it's a little bit like that you might be a redneck series of jokes, but but telling, I think. And then at the end of the quiz, I say, if you answered so many this way, you're a coastal elite. And if you think that a book that contains some sort of personality quiz is a really stupid idea, then you're a Heartlander.
Well, thank you for that. It's a great quiz. I know exactly where I come out, and um, I think as people turn through the pages of your book, which I hope becomes another New York Times bestseller for you, several
Well,
of
thank
your
you.
books have, we'll all know exactly where we stand. Now, we've had a couple of questions come in, returned back to the first part, and that is, how do we bring back some civility in a time of so much divisiveness? And Kay has asked that question.
Well, it's a darn good question, and I think a lot of us are wrestling with it. Of course, first thing I would do if I were a king of the earth would be to make social media disappear. I think social media has led to a lot of the animus and the anger that we're seeing in politics today. My take on social media is whose bright idea was it to put every idiot in the world in touch with every other idiot? And it seems like no matter how wrong you are about a political issue, you can, just with a click of your finger, you can go find a group that is much more enthusiastically wronger than you are and join right up with them. There was an idea, and I'm sure you remember this well, it was current even in the 50s, the 60s, certainly 70s, a communication that if we could just all communicate with each other, if parents could communicate with their children, the generation gap would be closed. If men could communicate with women, then the gender gap would be closed. If Black people and white people could just communicate with each other, all the racial strife would end. If America could communicate with the USSR, the Cold War would be over. This just doesn't turn out to be true. This was Marshall McLuhan was the great proponent of this, or not proponent, but the guy who observed this phenomenon. And he talked about us creating a global village. It was going to be television that was going to do this being long before the internet. And, but we were listening to Marshall McLuhan talk about the global village, but we weren't reading Marshall McLuhan. He was actually very gloomy about this. And I found a wonderful radio interview with him where the radio commentator is saying, well, Dr. McLuhan, you promised us we were going to have a global village. And he said, well, I didn't say the villagers would like each other. Sometimes when people get closer together and really hear what each other is thinking, I mean, who in this audience would care to have everything his or her spouse thought about him or her heard out loud right in the earphones? I think it'd be a very busy divorce court.
Well, thank you for that. Now, Susan has a question, and she harkens back to the protests, saying that riots, marches, those are not the problems. Most of us are concerned much more about the serious problems of the decline of the democratic processes here and autocratic efforts of the administration. Would you please comment on that?
I think that's a fair assessment. The decline of the, we've been building a kind of partisan anger for many, many years now. It certainly, I think it was sort of sparked in a way by Watergate. It became much more of an angry thing when Reagan was elected. I'm a libertarian Republican. What I always say is I'm a country club Republican if I could afford to join a country club and if there were any country club that would let me join. But other than that, I'm a country club Republican. And I'm a moderate Republican. And and I really, what I care about is controlling the budget, controlling the national debt, and not extending the tendrils of government too much. But we have been building this partisan animus, and it's almost like I feel that the Democrats kind of summoned Trump into existence. They kept saying that the Republican presidents were stupid, and that and authoritarian, and didn't care about people's rights, and didn't care about people's feelings, that they were heartless and cold, and they kept saying this until they finally got one who is all of those things. And that's very disturbing to me. Also disturbing to me is the way our political system, our primary system, and our system of local political organizations seems to push everybody to the edges. And so we wind up with, to take 2016, we'll stay away from this election, but to take 2016, wound up with two very, very weak candidates. One candidate's weakness is out there and obvious, and has been, for his first term. The other candidate's weakness was a little more subtle, but she somehow, I don't think she had it exactly, but she conveyed a deep sense of entitlement, and my gosh, was she a boring campaigner. It was almost impossible for a reporter to stay awake while she was on the stump.
Yeah, I think we see a picture of who the two you're talking about.
I think we do. I think we do.
Very good. Well, another question is now arrived, and this is from Jean-Pierre. He says, he lives on the coast of California, but he's not a vegan, and he does not have chickens in his backyard. And does that mean that he could harbor some hope for redemption?
Yes, it does. Jean-Pierre, thank you. Thank you for that. Although it's all right to have chickens. I have chickens myself. Of course, we live on a farm, so naturally we have chickens, but they're not backyard chickens, they're barn chickens. So if you get chickens, build a barn. But no, there's plenty of hope. There's much more middle ground in America than it would appear by looking at the news media. And I deeply blame the news media for this. I blame them for their partisanship, but even more, I blame them for that thing that as a reporter, I have been perfectly guilty of. If it bleeds, it leads. The only news is bad news. And of course, these days, if it's sleaze, it leads too. The worst side of people is constantly projected in the news, making us all forget how much we have in common. And especially before we all went on Facebook and made jerks out of ourselves with our political commentary and alienated all our friends and family. Remember, we used to be able to get together as neighbors, as friends, as families with vastly different political opinions, and simple good manners kept us from being too pushy about that. I saw these manners break down for the first time in the 60s with all the screaming dinner table conversations over the war and Nixon and Lyndon Johnson and so on. And I came home from college one time, my hair down to my waist and a jean jacket with a big red fist on the back. And my grandmother was a rock-ribbed Republican from downstate Illinois, whose family had been involved in the Republican Party pretty much since its founding. And my grandmother looked at me and she said, "Pat, I'm worried you're turning into a Democrat." And I said, "Grandma, of course I'm not a Democrat. LBJ is a Democrat. The Democrats are fascists, just like the Republicans are fascists, just like that fascist Nixon. I'm not a Democrat. I'm a communist." And my grandmother said, "Well, just as long as you're not a Democrat."
That's good. But to the point that you're making now, and that is the hostility that exists in the body politic. Phil is asking a question, and he says, "It seems to me that the word compromise needs not to be seen as a four-letter word." So how do we get that back? How do we get that back, or has it always been that way? And I would just add to his question, the question of tolerance and intolerance. I see a lot of intolerance in this country that I saw when I was ambassador in Saudi Arabia, but it was religious intolerance there. But this is almost akin to it. So how would you respond to Phil's?
Well, I'd preface it by saying that we have a long history of intolerance in this country. We are an extremely variegated country. We come from all over the place. And we're not a nation in a traditional sense of the word. We're a bunch of people after an opportunity, and not all those people came to this opportunity voluntarily by any means. Let's not forget a lot of people were dragged here by force and slavery, that a lot of people were chased here by the utter poverty and terror in their own countries, that there were people here already who already owned the place, and they were defeated, not in battle so much, they were defeated by demography and disease until they were made to feel like foreigners in their own country. So we're a whole country of foreigners, and we get along only by fits and starts. Now, when we get along, it's wonderful because somehow we took this mess of people who came here and who don't necessarily like each other very much, and we turned it into the richest, most powerful, and arguably the freest nation that has ever existed. But all through that history, there have been outbreaks of hostility, right from the hanging of the witches in Salem, through the Alien and Sedition Act under President Adams, an otherwise admirable man, the anti-Masonic Party, the Know Nothing Party, the Ku Klux Klan, the communist influence in labor unions in the 1930s. We have a long history of intolerance, but by fits and starts, we do get over this. It's a kind of a sine wave, and I think it will die off. Now, coming to that compromise question, is that's all government among people is. If we're going to have a democratic government, not everybody can't have it their own way. That's not government, that's anarchy. And I've covered anarchy. Anybody who thinks they're an anarchist should come with me and spend a week or two in Mogadishu in Somalia, and I'll show you anarchy. We don't want that. Yeah, that compromise has to be brought back. And of course, our political leaders are the ones who are making it into a four-letter word. We have uncompromising political leaders. One is much more loud about it, but the other is none too compromising either.
Well, it's obviously it's a question that we all face every day. Sometimes afraid to say what's on our minds because of the intolerance that exists in today's world. Now, Colin has a question that speaks to coastal and heartland, and it's about the Electoral College and whether or not the Electoral College, in your view, is obsolete.
Oh, absolutely not. The Electoral College is, I know it takes a lot of blame. It takes blame, for instance, for the outcome of the 2016 election. But that's really not a testable thesis, because if the presidential campaign, both those candidates, Hillary and Trump, knew the rules. If the campaign had been strictly for popular votes, the campaigns would have been very, very different. And I would argue a lot worse. They would have more resembled Nuremberg rallies, and some of them came close enough to that as it was. So we don't really know what the outcome would be if it had been fought strictly for a popular vote. But I don't think it ever should be. We were born as a federalist country. We were a union of 13 different states. And by states, we didn't mean governmental subdivisions in those days. We meant nations. It was a joining of 13 nations, which oddly, I guess we would be called, if we used today's parlance, we would have been called the United Nations of America. And that, I wouldn't want that. but we're the United States of America, and we give place as well as persons some say in our political future, knowing that the physical conditions of someone living in Pennsylvania be very different from the physical conditions of someone living in Massachusetts or South Carolina. About, I'm trying to remember the figures here exactly, but it's the great majority of the population of the United States, something like 80% of the population of the United States, maybe it's closer to 70, lives on 4% of the land, lives in cities. And so it would take like a combination of Alaska and Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Iowa, Nebraska, you name it, to make up for the votes of one big metropolitan area like Los Angeles. And you can't have people who are in specific situations in a certain place telling everybody in much different situations all over the place exactly what they should do. It just doesn't work. The people in Los Angeles don't know when to plant corn and when to plant soybeans.
So another question has now come in, this one from Jeremy, hearkening back to what you said earlier about the fringes of the parties and how the two parties seem to be pushing towards towards their ends as they get people through the primaries. What in your mind can be done to help people see the importance of coming together to move the country forward and bring the parties back to the middle? Title of your book, I guess.
Well, one of the things would be for the parties to reorganize themselves somewhat. The parties have, both of our political parties have such a diffuse organization that they end up being pushed by their most radical or least able parts of their party. Because basically the Republican National Committee and Democratic National Committee really don't possess much power. They're dependent on the 50 state political party organizations, plus the organizations in the territories. And those state organizations really don't have much power either. And both the national and the state organizations, for both the Democrats and Republicans, would be more centrist because their desire to get candidates elected. But even the state party organizations don't have that much power because they are in turn dependent on the county organizations, the county political organizations. And let's be frank about this, nobody in the United States who's quite in his right mind or her right mind pays much attention to county politics. I don't know who my county chairman for the Republican Party is. I don't know who the county chairman for the Democratic Party is. It's one of those things that gets taken up as a sort of weird hobby. I mean, you know, probably the typical Republican county chairman is like a retired aluminum siding salesman in a pair of plaid polyester pants that don't match his plaid polyester shirt, and the typical Democratic county chairman is an embittered divorced woman with 40 cats, you know, and this is who's running politics in the United States. So a strengthening. We think of the parties as being the cause of the partisanship, and there's some fairness in that. But the fact that our national political parties are so poorly organized leads to, I think, a worsening of leadership and a move away from centrism.
Well, PJ, you don't seem terribly optimistic about the way the political winds are blowing today with the parties. And another sign of that may be the question that David's asking. Why in 2020 are we not finding candidates who are under 70 years old or so?
Yeah, speaking as somebody who's over 70 myself, I really wonder. And the thing is, I know that I'm too old to be president of the United States. Frankly, I wonder if anybody who, other than, you know, anybody older than like a hyperactive 3-year-old on a big sugar high has got the energy to be president of the United States, given the kind of schedule that he or she is required to keep. But you know, the idea of somebody my age going out and having like 7 pancake breakfasts in a row, followed by 8 spaghetti dinners, you know, talking to, you know, every little town hall and every little, you know, every little organization all across America, flying night and day, not getting any sleep. It's really a wonder that any of them survive it. And why aren't we getting younger candidates? And I think one of the reasons is, who the heck would want to run for higher office these days? It would mean a kind of a personal inspection of your life that, gee, if your personal life can withstand that kind of inspection, I feel very sorry for you, because you haven't had much of a personal life. You know, it exposes you, it exposes everyone in your family to this horrendous media glare. You know, this is driving people away from politics. Now, mind you, that's not entirely a bad thing, because as my libertarian side of me doesn't want politics to play as big a role in life as I really don't like the politicization of everything. I don't think that love and family, friendship and religion, I don't think these things should be politicized. I don't think most of our way we make our living, you know, our career goals, our educational goals, our charitable goals, I don't want these politicized. So maybe the fact that we're not getting really good people into politics is maybe that's a good sign that we recognize that politics is often a bad way to solve problems.
Well, we have a younger person who's decided to run for state senate here in Texas, who became famous nationally when she opposed Governor Abbott's ideas about closing her hair appointment business. And she's being very well funded right now. And I know that you have talked about the fact that the cosmetologists and others are often licensed, and that there may be something in that for political leadership as well.
Well, I did note that in the District of Columbia, to take an example, where I did my research, there are 125 professions and vocations that need licensing or board certification in order to practice them in the District of Columbia. This runs everywhere from heart surgeon to nail salon. And yet we have these politicians with millions of dollars at their disposal and able to create crises of one kind or another for everybody in America and possibly everybody around the world, wielding enormous power. And there's anybody can, some people would say anybody did, wind up in charge of all this. Shouldn't we have some sort of requirement? But then, of course, I was baffled, because what kind of test would you give a politician that would be comparable to a medical board exam or you know, exam for a law degree? I mean, what would you ask them? Say little or nothing in 5,000 words or more. I thought about a true false test, but then I realized that really politics doesn't really include the concept of true, so it'd have to be a false test. And, yeah, so I didn't come up with, I did pose a problem, but I didn't come up with a solution.
Well, good try anyway.
Thanks.
We may end up with a licensed state senator here, however, I must say.
Well, good for her. You know?
We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
Now, Ben is obviously a longtime reader of yours, and he says, thinking about your book, Holidays in Hell, are there any locales that you're ready to revisit today?
At pushing 73 with a short stick, I would say mostly no. As you pointed out, I filed from 40 some countries, none of them the nice ones. And about in the midst of the Iraq War, when I was in Baghdad, toward the end of the fighting, Baghdad was we got Baghdad, but other things were, was still a little sketchy. And I just had I realized that I was too old to be scared stiff and too stiff to sleep on the ground. And maybe it was time to take this thing home. So no, now I want to go to nice countries. I've only been to Paris 2 or 3 times. It seems like when we get over this mask menace period in our life, I'm going strictly to nice countries from now on.
Good. But this does beg the question about when you were reporting from overseas and the way America was viewed at that time, as opposed or contrast with how America is viewed today. Would you comment on that?
I don't think it's too much different, Ambassador. I really don't. I mean, there's always been this thing. I was in the Philippines covering the Marcos overthrow back in the 80s. And it was a standing joke that among us reporters that all the anti-American demonstrators, and there were plenty because America was seen as being the main prop behind holding up Marcos. And boy, by the end, he needed a prop to hold him up too. I actually met him. He was ready for the ICU. It was a standing joke that the people would go out and demonstrate against America, and they'd demonstrate until 3 o'clock and then rush over to get in line at the American embassy to get visas to go, to the United States.
Right.
And it's been my experience that America in the abstract has always been viewed, maybe not always, but in my lifetime has been viewed with a considerable amount of animosity. But then when you talk to people personally, they're like fascinated about that you're an American and want to know all about America. And of course, American pop culture is dominant all around the world. And I mean, people really come up to you and ask you things like, okay, you're American, was your father, was he a gangster or a cowboy? I'm going, well, he was a car salesman actually, but.
Well, you mentioned how we're viewed, but here's a question about how we're viewed by ourselves. Some would now say, they would postulate that we're not the exceptional country that we've always thought that we were. That we're just one of a number of countries that's been active around the world doing this, that, and the other. Sometimes in a colonial way, sometimes not, and that we're really not an exceptional country. What would be your response to that?
I say that's nonsense. It's an extraordinary country. It's an amazing country. We're not the only amazing country in the entire world. What is amazing about us is that we fundamentally we made the great experiment. We held it together. The idea of a classical liberal democracy with a maximum amount of freedom and a minimum amount of government interference, with free markets and freedom of speech and religion. We created this concept. And now we didn't create it alone because it had deep roots in the English governmental system, although the English would tend to forget to apply it to like Ireland and Scotland and arguably Wales. Or any place else they went in their colonies. But we did apply the system and we made it work, and we got through the Civil War and proved that it could endure. And various other countries began to adopt, not because they were imitating us, but because the fundamental founding idea of America was very solid and very good. Other people around the world have adopted these fundamental ideas, 18th century Enlightenment ideas. And where you see those ideas adopted and taken to heart, you see wonderful places to live. And it's not just the United States, of course. I mean, it's all the English-speaking world for the most part, and many places in Europe have this quality now. But we're still the biggest of those, the biggest, most powerful, and most influential of those countries that have that wonderful life. And so, of course, we're exceptional.
So, does being exceptional mean that we have to spend a lot of money? There are a lot of political leaders today who want to spend your money, making us even better. And I know that you've got an interest in America's dire financial straits.
Well, that I do, yeah. I really, spending money, having the government spend money is not the most efficient way to allocate resources. Now there are certain things that we don't want privatized. I have been to various wartime. I've been to the Balkans. I know what privatized military would turn out to mean. We don't want a privatized military. There are certain things that we really have to spend money on. I don't think we want private police either. We have enough trouble with our difficulties in policing this country as it stands, let alone to hire that out to people as in the Old West. I don't think we want that. But when it comes to something like healthcare, I'm not saying that there isn't government aid necessary. I'm not saying that I don't want us to abandon a safety net, but the individuals and corporations and free market institutions are far more efficient with allocating capital than the United States is. And take a look at the bottom line at FedEx and the bottom line at the post office. Now, that doesn't mean I want to do away with the post office. I think it's one of the great unifying factors in American history. And plus, I'm fond of the postal people here. I live way out in the country, and they're very important. So I'm not saying anything, but I am, as an example, it's, think of the word public. When you think of the word public, think public restroom. Got to go to a public restroom or private restroom. Public park, private park, public school, private school. It's not that there's anything wrong with the government, that there's anything evil about the government, but it's not always very wise about how it allocates its resources.
Well, here's a question from Mark. I'm not sure it's a question that a lawyer would ask because I don't think anybody knows the answer. But Mark's curious about how you will take your political position to the polls this fall and who you voted for in 2016. If it's not too much to ask to invade your privacy, would you respond to that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a wonderful thing that we don't have to tell about these things in the United States. And you have to excuse me for one moment here because the sun is beginning to set where I am, or not beginning to set, but it's getting low in the sky, turning my lighting here weird. So I was trying to adjust that. But who was that? I'm sorry, who asked the question?
I think that was from Mark.
Mark, yeah. Mark, I'm going to spill the beans here. New Hampshire is a swing state, and it was a situation in 2016 where my vote actually could have, for one of those few times where your individual vote actually could have made the difference. And I had to say, do I go with someone that worries me a lot, that I'm not sure that he's reliable, that I'm not sure he's trustworthy, he's going to be in an extremely powerful position? Or do I go with someone with whom I don't agree about anything and who I don't care for very much, but who is wrong within the normal parameters of wrong? And so what I did was vote for Hillary. I voted for Hillary. I thought, well, I disagreed with President Obama about a lot of things, but we got through 8 years of President Obama's administration and everything was okay. I mean, not perfectly okay, but we survived. and will know how to survive Hillary too. And I kind of figured her also for a one-term president. And it's something of the same thing is going on with me. I'm not as I don't find Donald Trump as frightening in actuality as he was in potential, but I still find him worrying. I mean, I've raised 3 kids. He's the kind of, you know, if you raised kids in a 2-story house, you know that feeling of seeing the toddler at the top of the stairs. You know, there you are down in the front hall, and there's your toddler. You forgot to put up the kitty gate, you know, and whoa, 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 you know, he still gives me that worries. And so Biden, I consider to be a pretty second-rate candidate, but he's also been a consistent second-rate candidate. We know what we're getting. He's been out there since 1988. And so I'm probably going to go with him, unless it becomes very clear to me that New Hampshire is going to go in one direction or the other. In that case, I'm going to vote the Libertarian Party, which is where my heart is.
All right. Well, thank you for that reveal.
It's all right.
Let's-
Sorry about the visual you're getting here.
we see the sun is setting near the mountains up there in New Hampshire.
Yeah, it is. It's quite beautiful, but it's also kind of blinding.
We've got a Houstonian on the line. And,
all right.
Yep, the Houstonian is very interested in returning to your writing career and talking about local newspapers in general, the number of people who get their news from social media as opposed to reading the daily paper, and that his nieces no longer understand true journalism actually has or had standards. There's more bias than there used to be everywhere. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, even they're a cut above most online sources. But what's your take on newspapers lasting and where they are today?
I just think it's a tragedy. I think it's an absolute tragedy that we've lost print journalism, especially that we've lost our local newspapers. You know, there's actually in this country a lot more corruption at state and county levels than there is at the federal government level. Federal government can be pretty darn corrupt, but if you're looking for the worst corruption, it's in city governments, it's in county governments, it's in state governments. And without our local papers, there's nobody to keep an eye on things. And the standards thing, of course, is very important. I mean, being a journalist used to be a blue-collar trade. People took a lot of pride in their craft, but they weren't necessarily highfalutin world savers, you know, with answers for everything. They tended to be, you know, lower middle class, working class, Irish, Italian guys. Of course, in those days, it was mostly guys. And, you know, that if you didn't want to get up really early in the morning and lift heavy things for a living, and you like to read, you had 2 choices. You could either be a newspaper reporter or a priest. And so you had to make that decision. Is it going to be whiskey and women or just whiskey, you know? And so for a lot of us, it was, you know, it was a pretty simple and straightforward thing. But then you got the Crusaders coming into the news business, and that was certainly a deleterious problem. But worse yet is this fragmentation of the news. The nice thing about a newspaper is that it's kind of a big bulletin board. And in the process of reading about the interesting car wreck that happened at the end of your street, you see a story right next to it about some very important overseas event, about Brexit and so on. You end up sort of being accidentally informed just by the format of the newspaper. And then, of course, there's the say what you will against old-fashioned established legacy media, as it's called. It wasn't without its problems. It wasn't without its biases, but it had a broad reach. It had a wide audience, and this was kept. This audience was kept there in part by the advertisers. It wasn't out of the goodness of anybody's heart that they had abroad. It was a financial decision. The advertisers would say, we're a furniture store. We don't want to sell a couch just to Democrats. We don't want to sell a couch just to Republicans. We want to sell a couch to everybody. And so that kept the legacy media in line to a certain extent.
Well, speaking of writing, we're coming near the end of our programming for the day, and you have been a wonderful, wonderful guest.
Well, thank you.
We would not want to leave without asking whether or not you're contemplating another book, even though you're just introducing this one. And if so, what's the subject?
Well, I don't know yet, but of course I'm contemplating another one. I've still got 2 children in school. So I, much as I'd love to put the typewriter behind me and pick up the golf clubs, I'm afraid it's not to be, at least for a little while.
Well, I think in a way that's good news for all of us. And,
well, PJ, I want to thank you, and you're a good sport. I know Ambassador Oberwetter can put someone under some bright lights, but I didn't know he could put you under the scorching sun like that. So go out and enjoy that cigar, and hopefully our members and the other viewers will head over to interabangbooks.com and pick up a copy of A Cry from the Far Middle.
Well,
really
thank
enjoyed
you.
the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank all of you, and thank all of you in the audience. I had a great time.
Have a great evening, everyone.